Welcome to my field of dreams. It reaches far and wide. To you it might seem nothing much, but I stand here with pride. If you build it, they will come.
Hi, I'm Nemo James, singer, songwriter, and author, and I'd like to welcome you once again to my podcast, Nemo James Travel Diaries. This podcast is ad-free, but I hope you will forgive me for including short excerpts of some of my songs. If you would like to hear more of the songs I include, you will find a link to them in the show notes. If you enjoy this podcast, please click the subscribe button and share it with your friends. It will mean a lot to me. On this episode, we will be going on a Caribbean cruise. We left Seattle on January the 1st after spending a very pleasant 3 weeks with our son and his wife over Christmas. The temperature on the day we left was hovering around 0, so it was good to see that our destination in Miami would be 27 degrees, which would do me nicely. Geography was never my strongest point, so I was surprised to see that Seattle to Miami involved around 8 hours of flying, including a change in Dallas. I always like to arrive at airports at least 3 hours before my flight to avoid any stress, so I was a little concerned that our stopover in Dallas was only 45 minutes. It seemed impossibly short, but it was a connection with the same airline, so I assumed they would wait, or at least sort it out if there was a problem. The good news was that we landed early, but the bad news was that the captain announced that our parking place was still being used, so we had to hang around for 25 minutes before we could leave the plane. Fortunately, the plane to Miami was 20 minutes late, so we managed to get to the departure gate with 10 minutes to spare despite being given the wrong gate number. I was wondering whether the delay was to wait for people like us who had to transfer, but the counter staff informed me that a late takeoff costs the airline a lot of money, so there was no question of waiting for anyone. The fact that missing a flight might cost their passengers money didn't seem to come into the equation. With a 3-hour time difference, we arrived at our hotel around 1:30 a.m. I was exhausted and starving, as I had only eaten a sandwich all day. I don't like eating late, but I prefer it to the ultimate nightmare of waking up at 4 a.m. ravenous. I ordered a cheeseburger on room service, which hit the spot even though I had to drink it with water, as I had managed to book the only Sheraton in the USA without a minibar. I finished off the cheeseburger in no time and was left with a few fries and some onions that were so smelly that, with a few modifications, they could have been weaponized. I turned off the light and tried to go to sleep, but the onions wafted through the air and lay on top of me like a blanket. I rarely used room service, but I remembered that people used to leave dirty plates outside their rooms. I had no idea if that was still the custom, but either way, it was so late I doubted if anyone would come and pick it up. Unable to stand the smell any longer, I put the plate outside and went back to bed. I woke up an hour later and was having trouble getting back to sleep, as often happens when you have lots of stupid stuff on your mind. Top of the stupid list was the plate I had left outside, as we were in a country that led the world in ridiculous insurance claims. What if someone tripped over my plate in the middle of the night and pretended to hurt themselves? There would be a lawsuit, and as the hotel would blame me for the accident, I would have to pay $20 million in compensation for the emotional distress of the aspiring actress who had broken a fingernail. When I finally dropped off to sleep, I dreamt that Judge Judy was presiding over the case in one of her most vicious moods, telling me I cut the poor girl's career short and she would make an example of me. I woke up in a sweat, and there was nothing for it but to get up and retrieve the plate. I was concerned about opening the door in my naked state, but I was sure no one would be walking around at that time. I only had to open the door a little, put my hand around and grab the plate. What could possibly go wrong? I opened the door, checked that the coast was clear, and then leaned out and put my fingers under the plate with my thumb on top of the metal cover that kept the food warm. When I applied pressure, the cover did a somersault, and the plate spilt the leftovers all over the carpet. I got down on my hands and knees and had to lean out of the room stark naked and collect all the crap, which was smelling worse than ever. While I was doing all that, it occurred to me that those hotels had closed-circuit TV in the corridors, so either I would be arrested for indecent exposure or, at the very least, the security guard would upload the video onto YouTube. It was too late to back out, and I couldn't be bothered to hunt around in the dark for my clothes, so I remained au natural and collected all the crap together as quickly as I could, whilst trying not to throw up at the smell of the onions. Back in the room, I deposited the whole thing in a drawer, and it wasn't the considerable noise I had made that woke Federika, but the smell of the onions. Fortunately, we were both good sleepers and went straight back to sleep. At breakfast the next morning, I was sure everyone was looking at me, but maybe it was my imagination. Either way, I was not going to look at YouTube for at least a year. Next day, we took a bus to Miami town and made for the nearest sushi bar, which was fantastic, although surprisingly expensive. I remembered restaurants in the USA being much cheaper than in England, but not anymore. After lunch, it was a quick snooze on the beach and then the usual strolling around the shops. We were in Miami a couple of years earlier, so we had already done most of the tourist stuff. We took a taxi to the port to join our ship, the Carnival Glory, for a 1-week Caribbean cruise. Neither of us were particularly excited about cruising, but everyone we had spoken to said how great they were, so we wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Considering the ship carried around 3,000 passengers, my biggest concern was having to hang around in queues for hours, but I needn't have worried. When we first entered the passenger processing building, it was full and looked like a nightmare, but the whole process, including security and check-in, took around 20 minutes. We were given our cabin number, and as they didn't accept cash on board, they gave us a card to use, and the next thing we knew, we were in our cabin. I wasn't expecting much, but the cabin was big, with a TV, a sofa, and a little table. The only time I had been on a cruise ship was working on the QE2 in the early 70s. We were given passenger cabins, but they were the cheapest with no porthole and a bathroom just about big enough to stand up in. For this cruise, we paid extra for a balcony, which was well worth it as we were able to sit out there as we sailed slowly out of Miami. People waved from their cars on the freeway and sounded their horns. I had read in reviews that it was a problem on ships when passengers smoked on their balconies, as smoke got sucked into the balcony next door, so non-smokers couldn't sit on their own balcony. Carnival Cruises had just changed their smoking policy, so there was strictly no smoking on balconies, cabins, and most of the ship. With that in mind, I was incensed when we were standing on our lovely balcony when the stench of cigarette smoke wafted in from next door. 5 minutes on the ship and it already looked like I would have to wage war on our neighbour. Fortunately, as soon as we started moving, I realised that his cabin was downwind, so it was someone else's problem, and they could sort it out. Before setting off, we had to do the obligatory safety drill. After the disaster signal, we all had to stroll casually down to our muster station on deck and line up, while the crew pretended they knew what to do in the case of an emergency. I had heard that the captain was Italian, so I told Federika that in case of an emergency, we should stay close to him. The drill was over pretty quickly, and as everyone made their way to lunch at the same time, I was surprised there was not much of a queue. There were several places around the ship where passengers could eat a wide variety of food, but we ate in the self-service cafeteria, which was not bad. For the many diners who appeared to value quantity over quality, it was paradise. We had assumed that it was mainly old people who went on cruises, but we were very much in the minority, although maybe that was because the cruise was marketed as a fun ship. Everyone was very friendly, and there was no sign of any bad or drunken behaviour. Finding our way around the ship was horrendous, but all part of the fun. It had 9 decks apart from the leisure decks on top, and the problem was that decks 3 and 4 were blocked in the middle by dining rooms. On our first night, we went down to deck 3 and found a restaurant, but it was not ours, so we had to go up 2 floors to deck 5, walk to the other end of the ship and then go back down to deck 3 on the other side. We ended up doing that most nights. We knew our restaurant was at the back of the ship, but unless you are on deck looking at the sea, how do you know which is the front and which is the back? When we finally found the restaurant, there was a large queue waiting at the entrance, and so my fear of spending the week queuing returned as there were over 3,000 people to feed every night. When they opened the door, everyone walked calmly into the restaurant, and it was only then that I realized our table number was written on our card, so there was no waiting at all. I had assumed that the lunch we had in the cafeteria was where we would eat all week, so I was pleasantly surprised to find that evening dining was in a very nice restaurant where the food was pretty good, with plenty of choices. With wine at $30 a bottle, it was easy to see why the ticket price of the cruise was so reasonable, as they intended to make money in other ways. We found our table and introduced ourselves to 2 other English couples, whom we would be sitting with all week. Clive and Sue were about our age, and we got on very well with them. The other couple were elderly, with the man proudly proclaiming his 91 years. He was the spitting image in looks and behaviour of Victor Meldrew. For those not familiar with classic British comedies, Victor Meldrew was a character from an excellent TV series called 1 Foot in the Grave, and Victor played the part of a man who never stopped complaining. I will refer to our elderly dining companions as Victor and his wife as Margaret. Not surprisingly, the first question we asked each other was if it was our first cruise, and Victor replied,
"We have been on dozens, and this one is the bottom of the barrel."
Not a great start to our evening. Fortunately, Victor and Margaret were on one end of the table, and we were at the other end, so Clive and Sue acted as a buffer zone. We did our best to include Victor and Margaret in the conversation, but the duty mainly fell on Clive and Sue, who performed admirably. We did hear Victor say proudly that he had refused to pay the 10% service charge they automatically put on everyone's bill, which we thought was compulsory. He advised us to go to the reception and refuse to pay, and they would have to accept. It felt like a mean thing to do and entirely in line with Victor Meldrew's character, but a part of me admired his stand. During dinner, we were taken by surprise when the restaurant manager announced that the waiters were going to do a short dance. Scattered around the large dining room were small tables where waiters put plates when they were brought from the kitchen. Once they were cleared, music started playing, and a line of waiters danced out of the lobby dressed in white frilly shirts. Each of them jumped onto one of the tables and started a perfectly choreographed dance routine, which clearly every one of them loved doing. It was absolutely brilliant, and at the end of the dance the crowd went wild. We asked our very friendly waiter why he hadn't danced, and he said disappointedly,
"It wasn't my turn."
In my experience, staff were usually press-ganged into doing these things, but in that case, the waiters loved it so much they had to take turns. They performed a dance every other night, and each time it was brilliant.
Free rum, free beer, a party for every day of the year. Clap your hands and stomp your feet, dance along to the sailor's beat. A chair is not the place to stay when the fiddler starts to play. We've only got the rest of time, so jump right in and join the line.
After dinner, we had a stroll around the ship to see what it had to offer, and we were impressed. A huge theatre for musical productions, a comedy club, and lots of areas where an assortment of musicians played. I had to feel sorry for the musicians. In my day, we had a contract of 2 or 3 hours a night and had the day free to ourselves, where we could mix with the passengers if we wanted. We were given passenger cabins and ate the same food as passengers in a corner of their dining room. It seemed that now they were contracted for a certain number of hours, and they were used all over the ship, so they had to pack up their gear and move it every time. In the morning, they might play for half an hour on the pool deck, then moved to a cocktail bar and onto a club at night. It looked like they were treated as normal crew, so they had to stay within the crew areas when they weren't working and eat in the crew's mess. One thing that did bother me was that the cruise line claimed that smoking was only allowed in certain places on deck and in the casino. What they didn't say was that the casino was on one of the main entertainment decks and was open plan, so we had to walk through areas where there was an overpowering stink of smoke. The next day was spent entirely at sea, and as the weather was good, we sat on deck for most of it, with the occasional dip in the jacuzzi. Although the pool was very small, the area around it was large and with a great holiday atmosphere. Sometimes there was live music, and other times some well-chosen tracks from a DJ. There was another pool at the back of the ship, but that was even smaller and intended only for adults. Best of all, there was an area at the top front of the ship called Serenity, which was also just for adults and had 2 jacuzzis built in. They even had cushions on the sun loungers there, so they knew us oldies deserved a bit of comfort after a lifetime of heavy toil. We saw Victor and Mildred sunbathing in the Serenity area, in exactly the kind of pose I would have expected from Victor Mildrew. At night, we went to see a brilliant black comedian, and I hadn't laughed so much in years. What he said wasn't even particularly funny, it was just the tone and expression in his voice that was so entertaining. There were dozens of other little events going on all day for all ages, but most of them we were not interested in. There was also a 6-piece pop and rock band, 2 acoustic guitar vocalists, a Filipino duo and a 3-piece Latin band who were my favourites. I suppose the days of the big bands backing established cabaret artists were long gone. Our first port of call was Cozumel, a small island off Mexico, but we wouldn't spend any time there as we had booked a tour of the Xcaret theme park on the mainland. I had read some reviews of the tour that said it was good, but involved a 40-minute boat ride to Playa del Carmen in rough seas. We told ourselves the reviewers must have been unlucky and that it would be calmer when we went. It wasn't. 10 minutes after leaving the shore, the crew were walking around handing out sick bags. At least half the passengers had turned 40 shades of green. Federika and I were good sailors, so we weren't affected, but we found it uncomfortable being thrown around, so we ended up hanging onto a pole most of the time. The worst of it was knowing that we had to repeat the performance on the way back. The tour guide told us that because of the various currents and winds in that area, the sea was like that every day of the year. On the mainland, we were led to a multicoloured bus which took us to the theme park. Our guide talked us through everything, which started with what they called a river swim, but was more of a drift than a swim. It was all very well organised. We put our belongings into a locked bag and were told it would be taken to the end of the river, ready for us to collect when we arrived. We were given life jackets and told we had to wear them, which seemed a bit over the top as the river was only a couple of metres wide and full of people, so even a bad swimmer would struggle to drown in those conditions. We were led to a starting point which looked like Piccadilly Circus at Christmas time, but as we floated down the river, it thinned out. There were 3 routes to choose from. One was completely inside a tunnel, one was half in a tunnel and half in the open, and the other was completely in the open. We were advised to take the one that was only half a tunnel, which was good advice. The tunnel bits were interesting for those who were really into darkness, with the occasional glimpse of rock walls. It wasn't until we got to the open bits that there was anything to see, and that was excellent. I found it uncomfortable swimming breaststroke with a life jacket on, so I started doing backstroke, which resulted in some head-on collisions with cave walls. It took about 45 minutes in all and was very enjoyable. We then strolled around the park, which included areas where there were turtles, dolphins, sharks and various other creatures. There were also some Mayan ruins, but nothing to get excited about. We went to one section at the far end of the park, which had some hammocks that I had heard calling to me. After a very satisfying nap, we went to say hello to some parrots waiting patiently in a corner. They looked so cute they were just asking to be stroked. Federica got close to one and wanted to touch it, but the parrot kept trying to nip her. Getting braver, Federica leaned on the perch with her elbow, and in a flash, the second parrot ran across and grabbed her arm with its beak and wouldn't let go. I didn't know what to do. In all those years of karate training, we didn't have a single lesson on defending ourselves against parrots. It hung on for a few seconds and eventually let go when Federica swore at it in Spanish. It left a bite mark with a speck of blood on Federica's arm, so it was an official parrot attack. As we left the area, a man at a kiosk asked us,
"Would you like to have your photograph taken with our parrot?"
But your parrot just bit me. They're dangerous.
Not our parrots. They are perfectly safe.
What is this bite mark on my arm then?
Where were the parrots?
Around the corner there.
Those are not our parrots. They belong to the hotel next door.
I had to laugh, as it was straight out of a scene from one of the Peter Sellers Pink Panther films, except it was about a dog. We would have liked to have swum with the dolphins and various other fishy things, but a problem with cruise excursions was that there was never enough time on shore, so we had to leave and find our tour guide. Thankfully, the return boat journey was nowhere near as rough, and we were soon back on the boat after a long and very tiring day, which started at 6 a.m. That evening at dinner, Clive and Sue had already warned us they were going to the steak restaurant, so we would be alone with Victor and Margaret, but they were pleasant enough. Margaret was very friendly, but she had dementia. She spent ages studying the many choices on the menu, and when the waiter came to order, she had forgotten what she wanted. We learned to go through the order beforehand with her, so we could order for her when the time came, and Victor was relieved to have someone take over from him, even if only for a short while. It was an awkward dinner, as we had a choice of talking to Victor, who was quite deaf, or Margaret, whose hearing was good but couldn't understand a word we said. I must say we got quite fond of them during the week, and discovered that they were staying on the ship for 3 cruises. Despite being 91 years old, Victor had to care for his wife most of the time, so being on a cruise meant everything was done for them, which gave him a welcome rest. We docked at Belize, where we had booked an excursion to swim with sharks and stingrays. It sounds very daring, but considering the ages of people who were allowed to do it, we assumed it was safe enough. It wasn't till the night before that I noticed that the tour involved a 1.5-hour boat ride each way. After the horrific boat ride the day before, I was dreading the journey, but it turned out okay. The ship had to anchor a long way out from the port, so it involved a 20-minute boat ride to shore, where we changed for another boat, which was really fast. We stopped halfway to go down a mangrove, which was a welcome relief from the bumpy boat, and the idea was to spot the occasional dolphin, which did make short appearances, but only to tell us we were going the wrong way if we wanted to see stingrays. We finally reached a beautiful island, where we were transferred to yet another boat and given a mask and high-visibility jacket. We were taken to the edge of what was claimed to be the second biggest coral reef in the world. There were several other boats in the area, so the sea was littered with swimmers. We were split up into groups and each given a guide. We dropped from the side of the boat into the sea, which was waist-high most of the time. It was annoying that they gave us masks without snorkels, so we were only able to look at the sea life for as long as we could hold our breath, but it was still a great experience. The sharks were quite small and looked more like catfish to me. We were warned not to put our hands in their mouth, which, considering we couldn't get anywhere near them, seemed an unnecessary warning. We were also told not to grab hold of the tails of the stingrays, which would also have been very hard to do, even if we were stupid enough to try. The only real danger was the coral, and he warned us which ones would give a nasty sting if we touched them. While he was explaining this to us, a wave pushed me into a bunch of coral, and I could feel it brush up against my knee. It started stinging, and I had no idea how bad it was going to get, but I was relieved when it didn't last long and turned out to be nothing like as bad as a jellyfish. Whether it was a jellyfish, sea urchin, or coral, I always seemed to head straight for them like magnets. I still have scars on my body from sea urchin attacks 10 years earlier. I bought a disposable underwater camera, but it was very difficult to take photos underwater without a weight belt to help me stay underwater long enough to take photos. It didn't matter anyway, as water got into the camera, so I had to throw it away. The packet did say Kodak, but I doubt it was genuine.
When it's over, it's over. A man sits alone. A life of fulfillment, with a family of his own. Every week in a theater seat, the man becomes a boy. A mother in his heart, and a life that's filled with joy.
Back on board the boat, we were offered a rum punch, which was most welcome, but considering it had no effect on me, the rum must have been added with an eyedropper. We were then taken to a beachside restaurant for lunch. I had ordered lobster kebab and fries, which were good, but as we had pre-ordered to save time, my fries were almost cold. I ate them anyway, and later that night I had a very bad stomachache, which must have been caused by the cold fries. For a few days, I was convinced I would not eat another French fry for as long as I lived, but that resolution was soon broken. As always seemed to be the way, the journey back to the ship seemed much quicker, and with a few more rum punches inside us and some good old sing-along pop songs blaring out, I was surprised to find myself enjoying the ride. I couldn't understand why the boat took us back to the shore, which meant we had to change and take a tender back to the ship. I asked why the boat couldn't take us directly to the ship, and I was told that since the 9/11 terrorist attack, only tenders with licenses were allowed to take people to ships. That night we went to another comedy show. This time it was an elderly woman whom I didn't like at all, but Federika didn't mind. She spent half her act asking the women in the audience what perfume they wore, and the other half talking about poo. We also went to see a show in the impressive theatre. Next day we stopped at the island of Roatan in Honduras. There was not much to do there except potter around the shops and go to the beach. That night at dinner we found Victor had deployed a brilliant military manoeuvre. It was a reverse pincer movement where, instead of attacking on both flanks, he and Margaret sat in the middle seats opposite each other. I didn't know whether to be pissed off for making it difficult for us to chat with our new friends, or guilty that we hadn't included Victor and Margaret enough in the conversation on previous nights. After dinner, there seemed to be some kind of party going on. The funny thing about the cruise was that it was full of things that I would normally avoid, like the plague, but having accepted the cruise for what it was, I found it all great fun. We even joined in some kind of line dancing routine. I hate to admit it, but I even enjoyed the conga we were forced to join. Next morning, we stopped in Grand Cayman. We arrived late due to the captain spotting a distress flare at 1:30 in the morning. By law, any ship seeing a flare must go to help and search for several hours, but after 40 minutes, the Coast Guard took over, so we were back on our way. The captain said we would depart later that day, so there was no time lost on shore. Once again, we just pottered around the shops and went to the beach, which on this occasion was a 20-minute taxi ride away. We got a bit concerned on the way back when the minibus that was taking a few of us to the ship took a detour inland instead of going along the coast road. There was a Russian family who didn't understand what was happening and were convinced they had either got on the wrong bus or were being kidnapped. I have an overactive imagination and must admit that kidnapping did cross my mind. Then I remembered that on the way to the beach, the taxi driver told me that at 5 p.m. the traffic was terrible, so I guessed our minibus was avoiding that. But it was still a relief when we turned a corner and saw the funnel of our ship. One thing that became apparent during our short stay in Grand Cayman was that unless we went on an excursion which involved doing something specific, it didn't really matter where we stopped off. A bunch of shops and a beach is pretty much the same experience wherever you are, and once back on the ship, I couldn't differentiate in my mind between the two previous days. The trouble was that in some places there was just nothing much to see, and the excursions on offer didn't appeal to us in the slightest. At dinner, Sue and Clive outflanked Victor by getting to the dining room early and claiming the centre seat so we could sit together again. We felt a bit bad for Victor and his wife, but we did our best to include them in the conversation. The problem was Victor never stopped complaining, and he sent back at least 50% of what he was served. One night, he proudly announced that he had ordered a special meal by phoning up the kitchen during the day and ordering a curry. He did this because the food on the menu was so tasteless, whereas we all thought it was very good. I must admit he was served the most bizarre curry I'd ever seen, and certainly nothing like the specific curry that he had ordered. There was the usual plate of rice, curry, and bits and pieces, but then another plate of rice mixed with mayonnaise, which looked horrific. Victor informed us that the chef was catering to the American market, but my theory was that the chef was just taking the piss. The two comedians we saw earlier in the week had been replaced by two new ones, so we went along to see them. The first was another black comedian who was okay, but not in the same class as the first one. The second was one of the fattest women I had ever seen, and her entire act was taken up with intimate details of the sex life between her and her equally fat husband. It was so bad that I was missing Victor Mildrew's company. Friday was the last day and was spent entirely at sea. The weather turned colder and it was windy, but we managed a few hours sunbathing in a sheltered area mixed with some trips to the lovely hot jacuzzi before it started raining, and we went to our cabin. We docked early on Saturday morning, and the disembarkation was equally well organised, which was more than could be said about immigration control, which took ages. It was a great week, and there was no question that we would go on another cruise one day, although 1 week was just about right. Thank you for listening to Nemo James Travel Diaries. Photos and videos of my adventures, together with my music and the books I have published, can be found on my website www.nemojames.com/travels. You will also find details of my mobile phone app, Wordbanker, which is designed to help you build a foreign language vocabulary. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please click the subscribe button and share it with your friends. It will mean a lot to me. In the next episode, we will be travelling to Sri Lanka, Colombo and Anuradhapura.
Do you like the songs I've sung to you? Do you like the time that we've been through? Do you like my music? Do you like to sing along? Yes, we like the songs that you have sung. We like the friends that we've become. We like your music. We like your music. We like your music and the words of your song.